All right, moving on then. In Gravity's Rainbow, we are on episode 9, and I think I will devote this video to episodes 9, 10, and 11. 11 is very short, 10 is long and complex, and 11 is only 2 pages. But as things move along here, the story begins to complexify, and we start seeing Pynchon add more and more and more dimensions to it. And so what will happen with this is a kind of informational snowball effect that will just keep getting larger and larger and larger as Pynchon tries to make all these connections between everything you can think of. And here, so this section, episode 9, returns back to Roger, Mexico, and Jessica Swan Lake, back to the little house that they're living in illegally for their affair. And Roger is trying to explain to Jessica statistics and how there's something called a Poisson equation that creates a distribution map, a statistically probable distribution map for where all the rockets should land. And he says basically they can land anywhere. There is no place that is more safe to go to than any other. And Jessica's worried about this. She's like, can't you predict a way in which we can find a safe place where a rocket won't hit? He says, no, it doesn't work that way. And not only that, not only can the rockets hit anywhere, but that a rocket hits one spot doesn't mean that another one won't hit that exact same spot. Just like on a roulette wheel at a casino, and when he's debating here with Pointsman, he brings this up, and it's a foreshadowing, of course, of the casino of part 2. At a casino that, I think it's called the Monte Carlo Fallacy. Monte Carlo is a European casino. That once one number on the roulette wheel comes up, it doesn't mean that number is less likely to come up the next time. It's equally probable that that number will come up as with all the other numbers. So that's Mexico's understanding of the statistics. And the thing about it is he gets into these debates with Pointsman, who is a very strict, rigid Pavlovian, as we have seen, who thinks, and Pynchon tells us this, who thinks only in terms of binaries, either 1 or 0. Now here, a whole section is called Beyond the Zero. So we're trying to get beyond the 0. And Mexico thinks, as a statistician, between 0 and 1, there's an infinity of numbers in there. 0.37, for instance, 0.5, 0.25, point whatever. Such numbers do not exist for Pointsman. And so they go back and forth debating over this. And Pointsman comes to almost a state of despair about this, thinking that, well, this whole new generation that's come along that thinks in terms of statistical probabilities rather than causality. Pointsman is old-fashioned, and he's from the old-fashioned school, the cause-effect school, the linear school, that every cause has an effect, and every effect has a cause that precedes it. That's the whole model in classical Pavlovian conditioning. And so he thinks, well, is history going to dissolve then after this war into just a series of unconnected events, since there's no causal law connecting any of them, only probabilities? And that's the line here. It says, what if Mexico's whole generation have turned out like this? Will post-war be nothing but events, in quotation marks, events newly created one moment to the next, no links? Is it the end of history? And indeed it is the end of history. I see World War II as having ended history on quite a few levels, quite a number of levels. I'm actually working on a book about post-war literature that will be called Literature After History. In other words, literature that takes place after World War II, in which the whole system of European nation-state warfare, what Carl Schmitt in the Nomos of the Earth called the JPE, the Jus Publicum Europaeum, that whole world order based on the government of Europe by contending nation states is being ended here in World War II. And that's one of Pynchon's points here, as we'll see in episode 11, is that whole system of doing things, the nation state, the territorial nation state that is wed to a particular geographical location, warring legally. Legally, this was one of Schmidt's main points about the JPE having been ended actually by World War I. But you can think of both wars as a single great war with a 20-year interregnum. Everybody took a break to rearm. It was basically one war where he says World War I ended the JPE because Kaiser Wilhelm was tried for war crimes, and he was the first leader ever to be tried for war crimes, because during the period of the JPE, which came to replace the Catholic Church, the medieval order, so it was in place, let's say, from the 16th century on down to World War I, war was legal. You could declare war. The states could declare war on each other and go to war. It wasn't regarded as a crime. But that was the beginnings of the end. So that this whole world wars, both world wars, represent the ending of that order of things, the nation state plus its epistemological dimension that thinks in terms of cause and effect, which is the motivating idea of German idealist philosophy, starting with Immanuel Kant. Kant's whole attempt in the Critique of Pure Reason to solve the problem of causality and the absolute necessity of causality, which creates a deterministic billiard ball world of linear, Newtonian physics, and what the implications of that world were for human freedom of the will. Kant was very, very concerned about this and wrote that text in order to make room, as he says, for faith by circumscribing the limits of reason. In other words, circumscribing the limits of causality to make sure that we still understand that because the world is a causal nexus that is determined or even predetermined, does not mean that we do not have freedom of the will. And it is precisely what Schelling calls the abyss of freedom within us that is capable of originating new causal sequences for Kant, injecting new sequences of causality into the flow. And so, but this whole world, the world of the nation state, is being replaced by the transnational corporation in this novel, which is exactly what happened in World War II. We had transnational corporations like IG Farben, the chemical industry in Germany, and also subsidiaries of it like Agfa and Bayer, all these corporations on both sides cutting all kinds of shady deals with each other, regardless of which side wins the war. These corporations didn't care about that. These are cartels. This is a vast transnational corporate system that Pynchon sees having emerged during this war and having replaced the nation state. We are now, and so the whole thesis of Gravity's Rainbow then is, in studying Tyrone Slothrop and his the attempt of all these various shady powers, corporations on the one hand, and the military on the other, special ops, the White Visitation with the Pisces Project, all of them trying to control him, to take away human freedom, in other words. Pynchon is asking, what happens to the ontological status of the individual in a world in which it is entirely run by increasingly state-integrated corporations that are interlocking and creating this web of international, transnational control? What does the hapless individual do with all of these vast impersonal corporations and political agencies at work in the world? Where's there room for free will in this? Where is there room for freedom of the will? That's Pynchon's central question in this novel. That's what it's all about. And so that's the discussion that Pointsman and Roger Mexico have in episode 9. And then so we get episode 10, which is the first really surrealist episode in the book. It's very long. It's not exactly, I wouldn't say exactly that it's difficult to read. It isn't. It's no harder to read than anything out of William Burroughs, out of Naked Lunch. Naked Lunch has a very strong influence on this scene. It is clearly inspired, without question, by the routines of William Burroughs in Naked Lunch. And it starts off with this Pynchon having fun with this phrase, the Kenosha Kid. And Tyrone Slothrop is going to the hospital, to St. Veronica's Hospital, showing up as a test subject, and they give him sodium amytal. And there's a fuel in the V2 rocket called amytal. So there's a homophone, A-M-A-T-O-L is the fuel. Sodium amytal is A-M-Y-T-A-L. So I'm quite sure that Pynchon wanted you to think of that pun for those who could figure it out. And so he's gone in, and so once they inject him with this, what's called truth serum, then he has this hallucinogenic, surrealist series of fantasies. And it starts off with, I think it's very funny, it starts off with this letter. from the TDY abreaction ward, St. Veronica's Hospital in England, to the Kenosha Kid. General delivery to Kenosha, Wisconsin, which by the way is the birthplace of Orson Welles, to Kenosha, Wisconsin, USA. Dear Sir, the letter reads, did I ever bother you ever for anything in your life? Yours truly, Lieutenant Tyrone Slothrop. Then the letter that comes back from the Kenosha Kid reads, Tyrone Slothrop, Esquire, TDY, Abreaction Ward, St. Veronica's Hospital. Dear Mr. Slothrop, you never did. Signed, the Kenosha Kid. So then Pynchon has fun with this and reiterates this phrase, smart-ass youth. Oh, I did all them old-fashioned dances. I did the Charleston and the Big Apple, too. Old veteran hoofer. But you never did the Kenosha, kid. 2.1, SY, smart-ass youth. Shucks, I did all them dances. I did the Castle Walk, and I did the Lindy, too. OVH, the old veteran hoofer. Bet you never did the Kenosha Kid. And so on. It's just Pynchon having fun with wordplay. There's nothing more to it than that. As he's going into the hallucinogenic trance. And then he has this surrealistic fantasy, Slothrop does, that he has lost his harmonica. So he goes into to the Boston suburb of Roxbury, which was founded by Pynchon's ancestor, William Pynchon. And he goes into the hotel there, the famous dwelling place of Malcolm X in his early days. And here he's only referred to as the Red One, referring to his straightened out, dyed red hair from Malcolm X's early gangster period. And he goes in, he's been drinking and he gets sick, so he goes up into the men's room and he throws up into the toilet. And as he's leaning over, his harmonica falls out of his shirt and drops into the toilet. He's like, oh shit, now I've got to go down in there and to all that vomit and shit and piss and everything and go down into this toilet. And so apparently in his surrealist avatar fantasy, he can elongate his body and make it elastic so that he can descend down head first into the toilet. He goes all the way down into it, squeezes his way in, then comes down into the sewer system. And he's worried about being bombarded in almost a parody of the V-2 missiles over London, being bombarded by rains of shit coming down through the sewer system. And of course, too, there's also a reference in this scene to Benny Profane's, in V, his sojourn in the sewer system. This is why it was so important to go through V and Crying of Lot 49 first, before we did this novel. Some of the characters in V will carry over here, like Kurt Mondaugen is in this, so is Pig Bodine. And there's a couple other characters, Bloody Chicklets, who are first introduced in that novel V. Pynchon is creating a whole universe here of characters that overlap with themes and ideas. You have to read all three of these novels. You can't just sit down and read Gravity's Rainbow and expect to get it. It doesn't work that way. You have to work up. These novels are like steps, each one increasing in complexity. So he goes down, and it's like Benny Profane, in the sewers. And he goes through this all this hallucinogenic imagery, all this swimming in shit, basically, and waste. And then he meets, it transforms into a scene where he meets a cowboy. And the Kenosha Kid actually was a Pulp Fiction cowboy that was popular. I think it was in the 30s when the Pulp Fiction magazines were all the rage. And the Kenosha Kid was one of them. I forget the guy's name who wrote the Kenosha Kid stories. But here the cowboy appears as, here now as Crutchfield or Crouchfield, the Westward Man. Not archetypical Westward Man, but the only one. But so, the only one not archetypical, but it's a little puzzling because one means the archetype. That's the Platonic form of the cowboy. And so he encounters a series of ones. He says, there's one each of everything. One Indian, one cowboy, one battle. In other words, he's gone down into the realm of Plato's forms. The realm of the archetypes, or the archai, as I call them, that code for the realm of multiplicity and that's spread out in space and time and subject to causality. So he's gone down to the forms. And then that's pretty much it for his fantasy. It's long and it's fun to read. Very stream of consciousness. Pynchon, I remember remarking somewhere, it's recounted, remarking to a friend that he was smoking so much hash and marijuana when he was writing this, that he said, sometimes I go back and look at what I wrote and wonder, what the fuck was I talking about here? So despite his intellect, he wasn't always fully 100% in control. And I suspect very heavily the influence of hashish on this chapter. Yes, this man was doing some drugs at the time. Okay, so then we get episode 11, which is only 2 pages, but it introduces for the first time I.G. Farben. Cryptosam, it says, is a proprietary form of stabilized tyrosine. Tyrosine is real. Developed by, but Cryptosam, which means hidden semen, as we'll see in a second, is of course made up by Pynchon. Developed by I.G. Farben as part of a research contract with OKW. And here, this is the German Wehrmacht, the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, has contracts with I.G. Farben. Note that these corporations were involved with the military on both sides and with each other, regardless of the politics. And so these corporations, Pynchon is saying basically, these transnational corporations have now in post-modernity taken over the role that was formerly the realm of nation states. Those days are gone. They're as dead and gone as linear causality. All that's over with. They've taken over. And if you think corporations are apolitical, that's pretty naive based on what we just saw in the previous election. I won't go into it, but they are definitely not apolitical. And yes, you should be worried about that. Whether you're right or left, doesn't matter. That's a big concern. And so we find that this note talking about this cryptosam is written by one professor, Dr. Laszlo Jamf, which we heard last time in the last video. His last name J-A-M-F. That means jive-ass motherfucker from Charlie Parker. And but he is an important character because he is the man who classically conditioned Tyrone Slothrop when he was an infant in the 1920s. But we don't know, and we never find out precisely what that conditioning consisted in, but we're pretty sure it has something to do with why he has erections before rockets come in. There's some sort of causal connection there, but it's a vague one. So Jamf, and he's noticed that he's employed by AGFA. And AGFA was a subsidiary of I.G. Farben, the chemical manufacturing concern or corporation. And Jamf develops a mysterious polymer called Imipolex G. It's not mentioned here, it'll be mentioned later in the novel, but it's a polymer that he designed and invented that is put inside of the V2 rocket. And so there's a suspicion that Slothrop's conditioning somehow is connected with this mysterious polymer, this Imipolex G, which I presume Pynchon has made up, that it has something to do with him getting erections with rockets, or with the conditioning, or that his genitals were injected with this polymer, and that, so in a certain way, Slothrop is part of the rockets, because the rockets have the same polymer that his genitals have, which would account for the erections before the rockets come in. This becomes one of the mysteries that maddens Pointsman. Pointsman is the one character who is the most obsessed in all of these shadowy organizations with studying Tyrone Slothrop and finding an answer to this mystery because he's so obsessed with classical conditioning. And so that's the important thing to understand about this. And then the very short 2-page chapter just tells us that. We're back with Pirate Prentice. He's remembering his affair with Scorpia Mossmoon, who was the woman that he was wistfully thinking about when he was thinking about Roger Mexico and his relationship with Jessica Swan-like and being a bit jealous of it, Scorpia Mossmoon. So he's thinking about her, and then he jacks off and uses the semen to decode from the message that he retrieved from the rocket that he saw coming in on the first page of the novel that landed at 0 degrees longitude. There's the 0 again. The rocket that landed there, and when he went to get the graphite cylinder, that message can only be decoded apparently with this cryptosam, this hidden semen that's in the message somehow, and it requires semen to make it visible. So that's how he decodes it. And the message tells him that Pynchon doesn't tell you who this character is, but what the message says is that Katja Borgesius is one of the operatives in Holland, where they're launching all the rockets, who needs to be rescued. So he has to get in, get her, and get out. So that's the message. So that's it for Gravity's Rainbow. We're up to episode 12 and just about halfway through part 1, Beyond the Zero.